Hey everyone, welcome to another Screenwriting Tips. My name is Tony D, and today we're going to talk about how to write a vampire screenplay. I've written, let's see, at least 2 screenplays and a graphic novel with vampires. I kind of like vampires. They're fun to write. They're similar to the zombies in that you have to do your research and also get the rules straight. The rules are very important in a vampire screenplay. You have to know exactly what vampire things you're going to use. Now, people don't use them all. In some movies, you know, the religious aspects either don't work or they work in a different way. You know, that's sort of gone out of vampire movies, except for the older, you know, period pieces, where, you know, the cross was like a big deal because vampires were, you know, an incarnation of evil. In more modern takes on the movie, that's sort of gone by the wayside. I think it's partly because audiences have gotten away from religion. It's not a major focus for them. I think for a modern audience, it sort of undermines the power of the vampires. They like the more, you know, for lack of a better term, science-based version of a vampire, where it's kind of more like some kind of crazy virus that the person gets that makes sunlight deadly to them. And they tend to de-emphasize the supernatural elements. But there's a lot to work with in the world of vampires. There's different kinds. Every culture has strange different takes on the vampires. There's also a long history of them, so you've got little bits and pieces that are pretty interesting. One of the things I always liked, which they did on the X-Files, was that vampires supposedly have OCD. So one of the reasons they can't cross a door with you know, with like a line of rice or grains of salt is because they can't help themselves but pick it all up one at a time. So that's what happens in the X-Files episode, if you've ever seen it, with vampires. They drug Mulder, and at the last second he knocks over like a plate of uncooked rice, and it goes everywhere, and the vampire comes in and is like, oh great, and he has to like pick up every little piece, which is not going to leave him enough time to kill Mulder. So that's a fun, more obscure vampire fact that doesn't get put in it a lot if you're doing vampires. You know, people know the major ones. They know the sunlight and the wooden stakes and sleeping at night. That's a fun one to play with too, because it's like, well, they're dead. Do they really sleep? Do they really need the rest? That's something that a lot of different movies and TV shows have played with. Sometimes it's not that they really need the rest, they just got to keep out of the sunlight and there's no point to being up. Whereas some, they're actually asleep during that time. If you remember The Lost Boys, which is a fun vampire movie. I've always liked The Lost Boys. They're doing a TV show now, which I don't know if that's going to be any good, but I did enjoy the movie. It was a lot of fun. You also have to decide what your take on the whole vampire movie is going to be, what sort of tone. Lost Boys was dark, but it wasn't totally dark. There was a lot of fun to it. There was music. There were the Frog Brothers, Corey Feldman in his greatest role, both of the Coreys. You know, it was so there was some comedy in it. Had a kind of a comedic ending. So you know, that one was more light. Whereas you've got classic sort of Dracula movies, they tend to be very dark and brooding. Certainly Nosferatu is the really old black and white one. There's one with William Dafoe, which is very interesting. Um, what the hell is it called? You can look it up on the internet. It's a cool movie. It's about the shooting of Nosferatu, and then the premise is they actually used a real vampire for the movie. So, the Nosferatu type vampire, that's another one that doesn't get used as much. Um, there's going to be a TV show on Fox about vampires. It's a comedy show based after the movie of the same name, What We Do in the Shadows, and they're going to touch on that. If you've ever played the vampire role-playing game, that has a lot of info in it. Most of it's valid. You can't totally go by role-playing games, although it has a lot of good... I've often used the role-playing rule books, and I've written some myself, but I've used them to track down other information, because sometimes it'll have stuff in there that, that will lead you to other places. So the vampire book is good for that. For period piece type stuff, Boot Hill and Call of Cthulhu, the old versions of those games have timelines for things like weapons and inventions. And again, I wouldn't totally use the rule books, but you can use them as a basis to look up more detailed information online, from sources that are more valid. So, in a typical vampire movie, what do you have? Well, you have the first act, and typically you're going to be introducing the protagonist, which usually isn't the vampire. Kind of depends on the movie. Usually, assuming it's sort of a standard vampire movie, the vampire is the bad guy, and the good guy is the character that's going to kill him at the end. So the first act is mostly taken up by the protagonist and introduces the vampire, but we may or may not know right away if he's a vampire. Certainly the protagonist usually doesn't know. And then by the end of the first act, maybe we start getting an inkling that something strange is happening. Usually there is a love interest, because vampires are, kind of sexy and romantic. And so typically the vampire seduces the girl, because usually the protagonist is male, and then, that's part of the motivation of the protagonist to hunt down the vampire, depending on the version of the story. Then in the second act, you get more into the vampire stuff, right? So you figure out what his deal is. Usually the protagonist figures that out first, and maybe some of his assistants are in on it. If you look at a movie like Salem's Lot, great movie, by the way, very scary vampire movie. That one is sort of like the spread of vampirism, and it just kind of spirals out of control very quickly. And it's all about the protagonist just basically trying to survive. If you look at a movie like Blade, it's really more of an action movie, superhero movie. Not so much the standard vampire movie, but it's fun. It's cool. It's cool. Really wish they'd bring Blade back into the MCU, at least at the end of this. That would be fun, but what are you going to do? So in the second act, you get into the vampire stuff. Usually at that point, you're going to have to establish all the vampire rules by that point. If you haven't already, for the audience, because whatever's going to kill the vampire, you're going to need some inkling of that in the foreshadowing, so when it happens in the third act, the audience just doesn't go, hey. And then, of course, in the third act is usually the final confrontation with the vampire and his minions. Typically, it's the protagonist and his friends go up against the vampire. They have to get through the minions and then get to the vampire at the end. There's a big fight, or not, and the vampire is vanquished, or maybe not. See, it's kind of like, it's usually a horror movie, so there's always that, potential to have it end, question mark, right? Did he kill a vampire? Does the vampire kill everybody else? Does the vampire escape? You know, in The Lost Boys, it's pretty definitive that all the vampires are dead, basically. Maybe not. I mean, maybe David could come back because, as a lot of people point out in The Lost Boys, David gets impaled on a antler, and that's not a wooden stake, so maybe he's not dead. And of course, in a lot of vampire movies, if you stake a vampire, it only kills it temporarily, and if you pull the stake out, they come back, basically. That was established, say, probably in the Universal horror movies, Dracula, because that was a scene in Dracula when, or one of the Universal Dracula movies, I forget which one, they come across the skeleton of Dracula with the stake in his heart, and they pull it out, and then his body regenerates, and boom, he's back in business. So, you know, you can go that direction, or you can go a completely different direction. One of my vampire movie screenplays is not a Western vampire at all. I use the Asian vampire, which is pretty interesting and has completely different rules. Sunlight doesn't affect them, so that's a big one, obviously. But they have a few other things that are their weaknesses, but they are pretty scary guys. You know, if you just go online, there's literally one from almost every major culture in the world, and they're fascinating, really. I mean, you could make a movie about every single one of them, and you know, most of them would be horror movies. Some of them are very gruesome just to even look at, but you know, and some of them are more spiritual, if you know what I mean. They're not really entities. They're more like evil spirits. The Chinese one is like that I used. It's a little more close to not straight up vampire, really, more of a spirit. You know, vampire is not a word that's necessarily going to translate in every language. So every culture has something, you know, that's akin to a vampire. They may not drink blood. You know, the Chinese vampire, he actually eats human flesh. You know, so it's really more of a ghoul when you think about it. You know, the Western version of that is a ghoul. A ghoul eats human flesh. You know, depending on whether or not you're using the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual for reference, like I do. So in a vampire movie, those rules, those particular rules, are going to be very, very important. And of course, there's been a million vampire movies, so you really got to do a fresh take. That's one of the reasons I used a Chinese vampire for my movie. It makes it different, you know? And I use regular vampires for my graphic novel, which is still on sale online. You can check it out. It's called Lester Crenshaw is Dead. And that's more of a, there's a few vampires in it. It's more of a standard take on vampires. And it's got a little bit of the influence would be like the Anne Rice type vampires, where there's a society of them and different cliques. I called them cliques. You know, the vampire game called them something else, and you know, a lot of that comes out of Anne Rice. You know, the danger is, of course, when you have so many vampires, you know, supernatural or super heroic or special beings become less special if there are too many of them. So you have to be very careful when you introduce, you know, stuff like that. I did it, you know, it's a comic book. It's a little, the rules are a little different. You want to up the ante a little more. You know, you can go different ways with it if you don't beat it to death. But once you've introduced sort of that many vampires, then you kind of got to go in another direction, which is what I did for the sequel, which is online, Lester Crenshaw is Still Dead. I got away from the Vampire Society, and it's about just the main character who's a vampire and some other supernatural doings that end up falling into his lap. So when you're doing a vampire movie, it's really crucial that you come up with a new take. You know, I've seen different screenplays. Sometimes it's a metaphorical vampire as well as the vampire itself. You know, making the vampire a good guy. That was Amazing Stories did one like that. I believe it was, I want to say Malcolm McDowell was the star of that episode. It was a really good take. You know, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. But you really got to do your research. You got to do your research on vampires. You got to do your research on vampires movies and TV shows. Don't just jump into it, you know, and end up, I mean, you're going to end up with the same thing. You're going to end up with a movie, a screenplay that somebody's already done. And then you're going to feel like an idiot for wasting your time. Do your research. For God's sakes, don't reinvent the wheel. And if you're a big fan of these things, you know, I know it's very tempting to essentially recreate your favorite movie. It's very tempting indeed, but you have to have that new element in it. And you have to take it in a different direction. You have to. You know, I mean, there can be similarities, don't get me wrong, and there will be, especially with something as common as a vampire. But you need that thing that distinguishes your vampire movie from all the others. You have to be able to pitch it. You have to be able to pitch it in that one sentence. And I should talk about pitches in another video. That's a good idea. Note to self. So you should be able to pitch your vampire movie or any movie in one sentence, one cohesive sentence that, boom, you know, even if it's just blank meets blank, you know, two movies. You know, I do the Super Frat webcomic. Often I would tell my fans, it's like Animal House meets the Justice League. You know, it's just a shorthand to pitch it to them so they get, oh, okay. So it's about frat guys with superpowers. Simple. So you need a pitch like that. You could say it's Dracula meets whatever. Or, you know, if you want to get away from Dracula, you might pick something a little more modern. I mean, there's a great movie called Near Dark, and it's hillbilly vampires. Great movie. I'm a big fan. You know, the pitch for that would be Dracula meets, or maybe the Lost Boys meets, I don't know, some hillbilly movie. What would it be? Hillbilly movie. Can't think of one off the top of my head, but yeah. So, you know, blank meets blank, even if it's that. I mean, you should come up with a better pitch. You know, that can get old after a while. But you should definitely have 3-act structure. You should definitely have a different take. And you should definitely, in your own mind and in the screenplay, have the rules of your particular vampire universe clear. So the audience knows. So, you know, when the protagonist finally kills the vampire in the end or comes close or whatever, you know, we get it. All right? So that's vampires. Good luck, screenwriters. I got to get this posted. It's late here, and I'm so behind. But I'll see you next time.